We're in the Gospel of Matthew this morning. If you want to turn there with me, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2. In the year 213 BC, the Romans decided to attack the city of Syracuse, the Greek city-state of Syracuse. And their very able general was confident that he could defeat the city in a week or less. It took him about a year because of Archimedes. Archimedes was a Greek inventor and scientist and mathematician, and he was kind of Albert Einstein and Edison all rolled into one. And he created some wonderful, fantastic, terrible, unusual machines and ideas for defending the city. He had large catapults and small catapults and all kinds of things to defend the walls of the city. They had big cranes that would reach down and grab the bow of the ship and pull it up and smash it against the rocks. It was so bad for the Romans that it was said that the Roman soldiers, when they approached the walls of the city, if they saw a board sticking out or a rope hanging down, they would run away because they were afraid it was something that if you touched it, it would kill you. Some machine would come out of the wall and strike you. And then there were the mirrors. He invented a series of mirrors to focus the rays of the sun on the ships as they were approaching the city and set them on fire. These were not the normal ways of defending a city, which is why it caught the Romans so off guard and caused them so much consternation and trouble and took so long to... They eventually did conquer the city, but it took them a long, long time and a lot of manpower because things were so unusual, things that no one had ever done before, no one had ever thought of before. And that unusual idea is what we see here in Matthew's gospel, especially here as we get into chapter 2, that Matthew is going to focus on the unusual. Now, Matthew chapter 2 is probably a familiar story. If you've ever had Christmas, you've probably heard some of the things in this story. You've probably sung songs about some of the things in this story. So this is going to be familiar territory for some of us. But I want you to look for the unusual as we go through this chapter. Look at the contrast between the groups of people. And we'll talk about some of this as we unpack chapter 2 here as we move forward. Excuse me. So if you remember here, Matthew chapter 1 was the genealogy of Jesus. He is from the proper lineage. He is of Abraham. He is of David. He is Jewish. He is of the tribe of Judah. He is the rightful lineage for the king. And he is conceived in a very unique way, all of which Matthew is tying back to the Old Testament. Because, again, he wants his audience to see the connection between this person and all that God has been saying and doing up to this point. So now we get to chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Now, before we get into what they say, let's remind ourselves of who these people are. We have King Herod, who ruled from 37 to 4 BC. So Jesus was probably born in about 5 BC, when hundreds of years later, when someone came up with the idea of doing the calendar. I won't get into all the details. They did the best they could. They were a little bit off here based on the information they had. So Jesus was probably born in 4 or 5 BC. When Herod was ruling, he was appointed ruler under Rome. Now, the area of Israel, of Judea and so forth, is under the control of the Roman Empire, and they allow these governors, as it were, to sit on the throne. Herod calls himself a king, and the Romans allowed him to do that. But he's not fully Jewish. He's half Jewish and half Idumean, so he's not of the line of David. And this would cause consternation for him throughout his rule. He did some good things in his rule. A lot of the building projects, the Western Wall and the redoubts and so forth around the Temple Mount area were done by Herod. Some of it is still standing. Some of it has been destroyed over the years. Lots of building projects in Jerusalem and in Caesarea and other places around the country. So he was very much in the Roman mold of building great building projects and public works and things to secure his legacy. He was also quite paranoid and was not a very nice man. There's an apocryphal line that supposedly the Emperor Augustus said, but he probably really didn't, that it was safer to be Herod's sow than to be Herod's son. Because Herod had a number of his sons killed. He had his favorite wife killed. He had a number of people killed. Many of them, it comes to light later that they were actually innocent, but he killed them anyway. Anyone that he thought who was a threat to his power and position, he just had them killed. So this is Herod. This is the king who was on the throne at the time of Jesus' birth. Then we have the Magi. In the song, this is We Three Kings. The problem with the song is we don't know how many there were. It doesn't tell us there were 3. The number 3 comes from the gifts. There were 3 gifts, so they assumed 3 wise men. But we don't know how many there actually were. They probably came in a large caravan because they are prominent individuals, and traveling that far, you would need supplies to get you this far because you're covering a lot of territory through basically nothingness to get from one town a long way to the next town, so you would need supplies. As well as you always traveled in these distances at this time in large groups because otherwise the bandits would attack you and kill you or steal everything. So they probably arrive in a large group, and we're told here, and Matthew tells us that the whole town knows they're in town. So they probably came, here's a bunch of foreigners in foreign dress with camels and everything, come into town. So this is probably a pretty significant sized group. They aren't kings. They are magi. These are, if we go back to the Old Testament in, say, the book of Daniel, when Daniel is in Babylon, Daniel is chosen to be one of the advisors to the king. If you go back to the Babylonian or Persian kings or even Pharaoh in Egypt, they had priests and advisors and magicians and seers, these people who advised the kings on what they should do, what they shouldn't do, how they should make decisions. And so these magi are probably part of that group. So wise men is appropriate. Kings, they're probably not kings. They are astronomers, and astronomy and astrology were kind of the same thing at this point in history, where they looked to the stars to interpret the stars for what was happening. And so these men have been looking at the stars, and the stars have led them, or a star has led them here, at this particular place, at this particular time. Why do they come? They come following the star because they're looking for a king. Now, how would they know about the king, and how would they make this connection? We're not told. And that is a really fascinating idea. Some have traced it back to possibly Daniel and his influence in the courts in Babylon. Now, we know Daniel was basically second in command under the king at one point, and he set up a school for advisors to the king. So it is within the realm of possibility that Daniel and his influence in teaching them about his God, whom Nebuchadnezzar said is the only God. So we know Daniel had quite a bit of influence in his lifetime there. Are these men related to that school of Daniel years later? We don't know. But they've come looking for a king. They arrive about 2 years or so after the birth, so they would not be there. So when you set up your nativity, you set the wise men over here somewhere. They're on the way. They haven't. No, it's all right. You can put them with the nativity scene. It's okay. But they don't get there until a couple of years later because of the distance that they need to travel. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem. After that, in the days of Herod, Magi from the east arrive in Jerusalem. They're probably coming from the Persian realm, whether from Babylon actually or from somewhere in Saudi Arabia, we're not told exactly. But it's the area of Persia at the time that this is being written. And they come asking, verse 2, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now, they followed the star, and that's what we would term general revelation. So general revelation is what you can see in the creation that tells you about God. In Romans, Paul talks about this. The heavens reveal the glory of God, and God has written himself on our conscience. That we all have a sense of God, and we can see God in his creation. And that's general revelation. That's general information about God that is available to everyone. But general revelation will only take you so far. At that point, you need special revelation. You need more specific information, and that information is contained in Scripture. This is what God has revealed to humanity through his word over the years. So they come seeking special revelation. They have the general revelation. The star has brought them here. We've come seeking the king, and they will find that their answer, their special revelation, is found in the Old Testament. And when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now we understand why Herod is troubled. There's a new king. That's going to be a problem for him. This is something he needs to eliminate because it threatens his kingship. All of Jerusalem is troubled with him. All of Jerusalem, why would Jerusalem be troubled? The leadership in Jerusalem, the Jewish leadership, would be troubled potentially because if you have a king and you have another king, you've got potential for some kind of conflict between them, which brings the Roman army in to stop the conflict, and it also threatens their positions as well. A new king coming to the throne might undo all that they have done. So it's kind of an unsettling idea that we have a king and there's another king and the Romans are in the mix. So people might be concerned about this whole idea. So, verse 4, gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, Herod began to inquire of them where the Christ was to be born. And they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet." So they know the answer to this question. They know where to look. So they go to the Old Testament and they go to Micah chapter 5, which says, "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means the least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." So they have the answer to this question. They know where to look, and they correctly discern that the king, the Messiah, will be born there in Bethlehem. This has been prophesied before. And Matthew presents this as fulfillment, and we'll see in each of the sections here in chapter 2, Matthew ties the events that are happening back to the Old Testament. Again, he's trying to get his audience, he's trying to get us to see this connection between the person of Jesus and the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Some of his prophecies, like this one, are going to be precise. This is a precise fulfillment of this prophecy. Some of them are going to be thematic, and we'll talk about those when we get there. But this one is a precise fulfillment. The Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in fulfillment of this prophecy. And if you want to do an interesting study sometime, you can go back and look at the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah and see how they are fulfilled in Jesus. Matthew mentions one here for us. So then Herod secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make careful search for the child, and when you have found him, report to me that I too may come and worship him." Now what is Herod doing? Herod is plotting. When was the child born? When did you first see the star, so I can calculate how old he is, so that I will know who I'm looking for? You go find him and come back and tell me where he is so that I can go find him and worship him. But we know Herod has no plans to worship him, as we will certainly see a few verses later. So, verse 9, having heard the king, the Magi went their way. And lo, the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about what this star is. We know from its movement that it's not a normal star. And it's not a comet. It's not something normal that we see like that. It's got to be something else. We won't go into what it is. There's some really interesting videos about the Star of Bethlehem you can look at. But it's not a normal star in that sense. But when they look up in the sky, they see something shining. We label them stars too. You can see planets at night, and sometimes we often call them star when it's actually Venus. So they do just what we did. But this is what God has orchestrated this heavenly light to lead them here. And verse 11, they came into the house and saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him, and opened their treasures, and presented to him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. So they present treasures, costly treasures that would be found in a king's court. Gold, we understand. Frankincense and myrrh were used for fragrance and for incense and for all kinds of things like that. And all of these items are expensive. And they present these gifts to him. Now it's not uncommon for the king of a neighboring land to send gifts to the king of another land on the birth of his son, something like that, for the reign of a new king, to acknowledge that. So this was not uncommon, but here they come, not just to present him the gifts, but to worship him. And they rejoice, they're excited. This long journey finally has come to its conclusion here, and they worship. We don't know the content of their worship. We're not told the content of their worship, but we're told they do worship. Now, the idea of worship is multifaceted in Scripture. And the time period to worship, this verb proskuneo, is to bow down before someone. This is what you would do before a king. And from where they are from in the east, bowing down before the kings presented themselves as gods or sons of gods. Think back to Nebuchadnezzar. So this would be normal behavior for them before a king. But we don't have their background, and we don't have their state of mind as to what they mean by their worship. Do they recognize Jesus as the Messiah? Well, he's not exactly their Messiah, is he? Because they're not Jewish. Do they recognize him as the Son of God? Do they recognize him as God? We don't know the background of what they know coming into this, but they do come to worship. The more interesting question is, in my mind, where is everybody else? These foreigners travel who knows how many hundreds of miles to get to Jerusalem and are asking about the king who has been born, the one who is born. We saw his star, which implies that God is at work. It's a heavenly sign. Herod has the religious leaders look up, his advisors look up, and they look up where the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem. And they send the Magi off, so the foreigners are the only ones who go look. This just strikes me as really unusual, very odd. None of Herod's people, none of the religious leaders go to check this out. And they've told the Magi, our Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem, and you think he has been born. So you go check it out and come back and tell us. This is really strange, at least the way it's presented here. And I think that's the point Matthew is trying to make. This is very, very unusual in so many ways. And it gets more interesting and more unusual as we go. So verse 12, having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi depart for their own country by another way. So God now speaks to them, and they are clued in that Herod is not on the up and up here, and so they sneak off out of town and go back home. So when the Magi had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. And he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. And he was there until the death of Herod, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, out of Egypt did I call my son. One of the interesting things about Joseph doesn't have very much ink in the New Testament. He only shows up at the very beginning, and then we don't really hear about him after this. But every time we hear about him, what do we hear? He obeyed what God told him to do. He's a righteous man who obeyed what God told him to do. If that's all we can say about you, that's a pretty good life right there. We don't know much else about him, but we do know every time God spoke to him, Joseph immediately obeyed. If you can put that on my tombstone, I'll be happy. But again, God speaks to Joseph in a dream. Joseph obeys, and Matthew attributes this to the Old Testament. This is a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy, he says here in verse 15. This is Hosea 11. Hosea 11 refers to the Exodus, that God called his people Israel out of Egypt, which we all understand. So this is not a precise fulfillment in that Hosea wasn't speaking about the Messiah when he wrote what he wrote. He was looking back at the Exodus. And so Matthew isn't claiming that what Hosea 11 verse 1 says was a messianic prophecy specifically about the Messiah. He is thematically quoting Hosea. The theme of Hosea, as Matthew will do, one of the interesting things to look in the book of Matthew is the number of times that Matthew equates Jesus with Moses. Jesus is the new Moses. And so here in his birth, he is linking Jesus with the Exodus and Jesus with Moses, as he'll go on to talk about later, calling God coming to Moses in Exodus chapter 4 and telling him, you can now go back because the one who was seeking your life is killed. God will say the same thing to Joseph here after Herod dies. So this is a patterned fulfillment, not a precise fulfillment, but a patterned fulfillment or a thematic fulfillment, that Matthew is looking back at the Old Testament and saying, Jesus is like Moses, and like God called his son, or sons, Israel, out of Egypt. Now, and that's what Hosea says. The theme there in Hosea 11 is sonship, that Israel was God's son, and he called his son out of Egypt. Now he is calling his son, his one and only son, out of Egypt. And so this is, again, it's not a precise fulfillment in that Hosea is speaking of the Messiah, but it's a thematic or patterned fulfillment that Matthew wants to connect in our minds so that we see the sonship connection between Jesus and the nation of Israel and what God is doing. So he sends the family to Egypt, and there they wait. Beginning in